It's a great pleasure to be here. I think to look outside the bubble, which is the theme of this panel, requires a great exercise, and I think it's a very important exercise for us to have today here. So I'd like to share with you today a little bit about my experience in working in Brazil, and also trying to bring about a situated dialogue on how do we understand the situated impact and of these emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. How do we understand the empowerment of populations, as Neville was mentioning? So just to start out, I'd like to go briefly through 3 points that I'd like to share with you today that have been perhaps the 3 trends as we have been experiencing in Brazil, and things to look forward as we progress in the next coming years. And the first of them, this does not go without mentioning, is the challenge of safeguarding democratic institutions, of safeguarding democracy in the context of disinformation. And just to start out, Brazil is 70% of the Brazilians are connected to the internet. And that is a great deal part of a country, if you think that holds almost continental proportions, the biggest country in Latin America. And as one of the reports that I recurrently come back to, which is the LSE's report on the Trust and Technology Commission, which says that right now we're faced with an information crisis that is systemic and that calls for a coordinated long-term institutional response. And it also talks about what they call the 5 giants, the 5 big evils of the time that we're living, which is mostly focused on confusion, cynicism, fragmentation, irresponsibility, and apathy. And I think these big evils, they are very much characterizing what we've been seeing in Brazil. And in the context of the elections last year, I think that was quite evident that in a country that is facing economic crisis and political instability and trying to understand where we're going in terms of democracy, I think it does not come with mentioning how crucial it is for us to be alert with that. In the context of the elections last year, and I'm just going to talk about this case because it is representative of the way the population has been changing in terms of media consumption. I said already that 70% of Brazilians are connected to the internet, but of these 70%, 120 million people in Brazil actually use WhatsApp, and WhatsApp is the epicenter to the public discussion as we know it right now. Last year, what we faced was that what is now the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, he only attended 1 or 2, if I'm not mistaken, public debates in the television. But what happened is that the mobilization of social media in that context was so crucial that it made us think, well, what is the shift in terms of public debate? What is the shift in terms of where are we having these types of conversation? And they are happening mostly in Facebook and in WhatsApp. And so in a context that we're living right now, it is pretty much trying to understand where do we go. And in Brazil, we tried to develop different mechanisms. At the international level, we saw the International Grand Committee on Fake News, in which the UK tried to host different countries, and that was something very innovative, and Brazil was over there sharing the experience of the previous elections. And over in Brazil, trying to also get multi-stakeholder participation to advance in trying to develop mechanisms. The second trend that I'd like to share with you, and I'm just bringing these trends so that we can have further discussion, is the convergence between biometrics and AI-based technologies. In Latin America and in Brazil, there is what I like to call the potential trap for technological enthusiasm, which is basically the idea that innovation is the goal, and that we don't have to kind of balance out how do we see these types of innovation. And over at Igarapé, we have been doing in-depth research on the implementation of monitoring technologies in different cities across Brazil. And one of the things that we found out as we were diving deep into the implementation by public authorities of facial recognition technologies is that right now we have identified 54 cases of that have been publicly reported since 2011. So what we think is something new, and something new in the context of developing countries, is not necessarily new. What we see is that globally, these are things that are emerging, these are trends, but are we following up with regulation? Are we following up with a public debate that is critical, that can assess the digital liberties and the liberties, the civil liberties that are being placed in check over here? So what we also discovered is of the 26 states in Brazil, 15 of these states are already using facial recognition technologies for 4 different types of ends, to put it plainly. The first is for transportation and identifying frauds. The second is for public security, which is the one that we normally discuss and that gets more media notoriety. The third is education. So how do we control the school attendance? How do we make sure that people are actually going to school? And that is pretty much a concern in public schools. And finally, border control, which is also one of the most notable and more recognized cases. So how do we safeguard the right to privacy, the right to freedom of assembly? How do we understand the impacts of these technologies in countries so unequal as Brazil? And what we've seen is a geography of violence that has been forming, a new configuration of these geographies of violence, where the moderate side are mostly middle to upper class areas in cities in Brazil, while the other areas are still very much monitored by a type of surveillance that is physical, that you actually go to the places and you control and you intervene. But the types of intervention on these middle and upper class and the type of monitoring that you get over there is very much mediated. So what does that have to say about the types of violence and the types of insecurity and security that we're producing over there? And finally, just to close up, because I know I'm almost out of my time, is the last point that I'd like to touch upon is definitely when it comes to developing a big data society, if we want to call it that way, or because we were talking about this before, we also need to consider the vulnerabilities. And in Brazil, another of the things that we have been working a lot on is on national cybersecurity. How do we ensure that our national cybersecurity governance is actually taking forward a debate on shared responsibilities, understanding that in order for us to have a stable ecosystem, not only for interconnected devices, but also for society as a whole and for critical infrastructures, we need to have a more inclusive dialogue. And in that sense, just to give you a couple of numbers, in Latin America, the number of attacks has rose 59% in the last 2 years, which means that there are 33 attacks per second. And in Brazil specifically, the greatest types of attack that have been reported is more specifically DDoS attacks related to interconnected devices. However, at the same time, we have a national IoT plan that sets out a very strategic view for how do we understand the implementation of these technologies for strategic sectors, such as agribusiness. However, on the other hand, we're very much still missing a discussion on what do we mean by privacy by design and security by design, and how do we appropriate ourselves of these types of discussions. And nationally, it's the first time we actually debated about cybersecurity in Brazil, and that was officially mentioned, was in 2008 with our national defense strategy, which cyber was defined as one of the strategic sectors. But what we see is that only now, 10 years almost later, is that we're really developing our national cybersecurity strategy, which is currently underway. So there are lots of questions to be answered. I hope I gave a panorama of the key 3 trends that are shaping and that should be in the horizon, not only for Brazil, but in terms of looking at developing countries and how do we situate these debates. Thank you.